Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to see you today. I am Mike DeGeer, the Vice Chair for Advocates for Public Education Policy, and we have a wonderful presentation today that Rob Rogers is going to be introducing for us in just a minute. I just wanted to quickly tell you about our organization and thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. Advocates for Public Education Policy is a statewide organization. We're a coalition of individuals and grassroots organizations that work to educate the public and policymakers to ensure that public schools work for all. We believe that our students are being judged unfairly by test scores. There's much more in their learning than test scores to determine their outcomes and the measurement of their learning. We believe our public schools are subject to corporate moneyed interests that seek to privatize education through charters and vouchers, and we believe this is not working well for our public school students. We also believe that our education system in Colorado especially is woefully underfunded as well as across the nation. And I'm really excited to introduce Rob Rogers, our board member, who's going to provide us with our speaker today and introduce her, and we're really excited to have her today. I just finished her book, Money Lies in God, and I'm a big believer in it, and I encourage you all to get the book. It's going to be a great presentation. Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I'm really excited that Katherine was willing to do this for us. And Katherine, I'm not going to read your bio just to give everybody an exposure to your breadth of work and what you bring to the table too, just for people that aren't familiar. Katherine Stewart has been covering the rise of anti-democratic movement for over 16 years. Her latest book, Money Lies in God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, is an instant New York Times bestseller. Her previous book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, won first place in the nonfiction books category from Religion News Association, as well as a Morris B. Forcus, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, Best Book Award. The Power Worshippers formed the basis of the documentary feature God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner. Stewart served as executive producer. Her 2012 book, The Good News Club, The Christian Right Stealth Assault on America's Children, focused on the religious right's efforts to undermine public education. Her writing appears in the New York Times, Op-Ed, New Republic, Religion News Service, and others. And her Substack is at katherinestewartbooks.com, and she's on Blue Sky. And I'll provide those links in the chat a little bit later on. I've probably recommended your book, Power Worshippers, more than just any other book that I recommend on a regular basis, just because it's such a great primer for what we are all experiencing. So one of the many reasons that I'm excited that you agreed to come and talk to us. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. My way into this world was really through the sort of discovering the war on public education, and each of my subsequent books has included a section on public education. Back then I recognized that public education is an essential pillar of our democracy, and this is one of the reasons why they're so intent on destroying it. So I'm really grateful for the work that you do, and I'm grateful to everybody tuning in today.
I am sure that you probably get tired of answering this question, but I think it probably would be useful just as a foundation. And how do you define Christian nationalism, and specifically how does that differ from true Christianity and faith practice? Just so everyone understands where you're coming from.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think of Christian nationalism first. It's not Christianity. It's not a religion. It's two things. It's both an anti-democratic political ideology that makes use of religion for anti-democratic purposes, or I should say exploits religion for politics and power. And secondly, it's also a deeply networked, very well-funded political movement that has all of, the strength of this movement is in its sort of dense organizational infrastructure. So it's kind of a mindset and also machine. The ideology of Christian nationalism says that America is founded to be a Christian nation according to a certain sort of interpretation of the Christian faith. Our laws should be based on the Bible. This is what made us great at one point, and we need to we've lost this heritage, and we need to get it back. Right. So that's a sort of ideology. But the machine, I think of as really, it's got this, it's leadership driven and it's organization driven. And the organizations can be divided into categories. I'll throw out a few names, but it's by no means comprehensive. You have right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council and Heritage and the American Family Association. You have networking organizations like the Council for National Policy and ZICLAG, which bring sometimes leaders of the different organizations together with deep-pocketed funders, and sometimes also with certain politicians, and sort of do a lot of sort of coordination. You have a very sophisticated legal advocacy sphere with groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty, determined to basically reinterpret the religion clauses of the First Amendment, determined to destroy the constitutional principle of church-state separation. You have groups like, within that sort of sphere, you have the Federalist Society, which plays a really critical role in grooming and promoting sort of legal talent for those who have the sort of correct ideological approach. Very sophisticated data initiatives. I think a very underappreciated feature of the movement are the pastoral networks. They have names like Watchmen on the Wall and Faith Wins. These organizations gather pastors, conservative-leaning and conservative pastors, into networks. They give them tools for turning out their congregations to vote for supposedly biblical candidates, or for even supposedly biblical school board members, or those with a sort of correct ideological orientation. And listen, movement leaders know that pastors are sometimes the most trusted voices in their community. If they can get to the pastors, they can turn out their congregations. And listen, this movement, its leadership as well as its supporters represent a minority of our population, but they succeed in turning out their votes in disproportionate numbers, precisely because of the organization of the Christian nationalist movement. So I hope that it's not a short explanation, but I hope it helps.
There isn't a short explanation for it, is what I've found, because it's been going on for so long and it is so complicated. But that's actually a good segue too into your newest book, Money, Lies, and God, which is outstanding, and it really talks a lot about that the machine and the financial and political machinery that's behind all of this. We're focused primarily on advocating for public education. So how are some of the ways that machine is directly impacting public education?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say that public schools have been flashpoints for the culture wars for decades. So when I started researching this movement over 16 years ago, it was really clear that it was deeply hostile to the institution of public education, precisely because public ed is meant to be non-sectarian, neither affirming nor denigrating any particular form of religion, and also welcoming to all families, regardless of their religious background and their ethnic background, et cetera. Jerry Falwell, in an earlier time, made the agenda clear. In 1979, he said, "I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Christians will have taken them, or churches will have taken them over, and Christians will be running them." Other powerful leaders like D. James Kennedy, who received millions of dollars from the family of former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, said that schools were atheistic and amoral and were brainwashing children in godless secularism. And I pulled this pamphlet just because I love to bring the receipts for stuff that I quote. D. James, it's called A Godly Education. It's a sermon that was turned into a pamphlet, very popular amongst D. James Kennedy's listeners. He had a very, very popular, widely distributed radio show. And he wrote, "My friends, the anti-Christian, anti-God bias, the censorship of all things Christian, and the infusion of an atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, one-world, anti-American system of education in our public schools has indeed become such that if it had been done by an enemy, it would be considered an act of war." These very words are actually paraphrased by a lot of religious right leaders today. I can't recall the exact year that he wrote this, but it was quite some time ago. So the sort of religious right has had their aims on public education for a long time. And the fundamental goal has always been to create publicly funded, publicly financed religious schools to destroy public education as we know it. There's sort of a two-pronged strategy to force their programming into public schools through Bible clubs and, the kind of shenanigans we're seeing these days, like the Ten Commandments laws in public schools and mandated Bible curriculum that comes from a very reactionary standpoint. Religion and Christianity especially is incredibly diverse in our country. And this is a movement that really denigrates sort of social gospel focused Christianity as woke Christianity. And they want to infuse their view in the public schools. So they want to do that, force their programming into the public schools to remake them in the way that they want them. And also they want, and taking over the school boards, et cetera, is a big part of that. We can talk about that later, but also defund public education by siphoning money off to vouchers and religious schools, and even creating totally taxpayer financed explicitly religious schools. And we saw that effort in the St. Isidore case, St. Isidore versus Drummond, which actually failed only because Amy Coney Barrett, Supreme Court Justice Barrett, was able to recuse herself or had to recuse herself. She had very close ties to one of the judges, one of the lawyers representing St. Isidore, and to the legal academy that was representing St. Isidore. But we can be sure that other similar types of cases are running through other states, and that she will not be able to recuse herself the next time. So yeah, the goal is twofold. Destroy public education by defunding it, and funneling all that money to either charter schools with right-wing and religious agendas or directly into religious schools through vouchers or even through the cases like the St. Isidore case, but also with the existing public schools to force their programming into them.
And the Ten Commandments cases that have been coming up, and there was another one in Louisiana that was just found to be unconstitutional. Especially for someone who maybe hasn't been all that embedded or familiar with the evangelical movement itself, the placement of a Ten Commandments poster in a public school, maybe that seems a little innocuous to some people. Why is it not innocuous?
Well, because it conflates a certain interpretation of religion in the minds of very young children. Look, kids cannot make a distinction between something that's taking place in their school and something that's sponsored by their school. Public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of children and young children, especially if it's happening in the public schools. They think it's what their public school wants them to believe. The groups like the American Family Association are sort of not just helping to coordinate these initiatives, but also producing these posters, and they're complete. It's a completely reactionary organization with a very particular kind of interpretation of the Christian faith, and that's why it's unconstitutional. Again, public schools are supposed to neither denigrate nor affirm any particular religious viewpoint. They're supposed to be welcoming to all families. And when you have a public school that appears to endorse a particular view of religion, it makes certain kids feel like they belong and other kids feel like they simply don't belong at all. It sort of establishes a hierarchy of belief. It's incredibly coercive, and it's also unconstitutional. And there's another thing I sort of neglected to say, but it's really important to remember at this time when we're seeing these Moms for Liberty types ignite these needless skirmishes in public schools and even with the battles around Ten Commandments laws. Movement leaders have undermined public education at every turn. They've ignited these needless conflicts and panics over critical race theory and things like that, or some of the gender ideology stuff, in order to foster mistrust in public schools and pave the way for privatization. These Ten Commandments laws are incredibly divisive by design. And the division and conflict that these kinds of initiatives promote in diverse public school communities are not an unintended consequence of their activity. They're not just like, oh, we really sincerely believe in the Ten Commandments and, oh, we really don't want anybody to feel bad. No, the desired end state is a system where people lose faith in their public schools. A lot of families feel like they don't believe. They stop volunteering in the public schools. They pull their kids out, perhaps, if they can. And the desired end state is a system where taxpayers either directly fund religious schools or supply parents with vouchers, and then parents are using those vouchers to funnel money into religious schools. So these kinds of divisive initiatives are, cynically speaking, a kind of twofer. They promise to eventually be profitable for the religiously motivated entrepreneurs who are involved in this. And at the same time, they're intended to build a constituency for Christian nationalist politics.
And you talk a lot about the financial aspects of that also in Money, Lies, and God, as per the title. So this is not just purely a religious motivation either. There's also clearly a profit motive from this as well. Can you talk a little bit about that, about those intersections?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of money poured into K through 12 education. And at a time when a lot of churches are losing membership, to be honest, religiously motivated sort of power worshipers, can I call them that? The sort of power players of the movement know, and the sort of hyper political pastors that they're allied with, know that if they can capture a portion of that money, that taxpayer money, then they can sustain their churches with religious schools and things like that. Look, it's often about the money. They want taxpayer money. They want direct public funding for religious organizations, and that's been a goal of the movement for quite some time. They resent public schools because they are community focuses. They teach kids how to get along with others, including those who are different. And they don't want the schools to be the community's centers. They want their religious institutions to be the community centers. And that's, one of the reasons why they're so engaged in this fight for to destroy public education. I used to struggle when in 2008, I started researching this movement. It took me a long time to really wrap my head around the fact that the movement was incredibly destructive, that they weren't just trying to force their programming into public schools, but that they really wanted to destroy public education. But, I started to look at the roots of a lot of the folks' leadership behind the Christian nationalist movement, people like, I don't know, David Barton, who's one of the key myth makers, who's had a key role in sort of trying to have our American history curricula reflect a sort of, I would say, far-right ideological and religious values as well. And I started to dig into their intellectual progenitors. And I came across this fellow named Rousas John Rushdoony. He's a mid-century theologian. He wrote this book titled The Messianic Character of American Education. I mean, he's only one thinker among many, but he spoke about public education the most. This is like an entire screed devoted to hate of public schools. He talked about how they're basically promoting chaos and disintegration into the void and training women to be men. He also quotes he quotes some of the pro-slavery theologians, people like A. Hodge and Dabney, Robert Louis Dabney, who hated public education, who actually came up with the term government schools, which is a term that the religious right often uses to describe public education. And Hodge wrote, I am as sure as I am as sure as I am of Christ's reign that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education separated from religion, as is now commonly proposed, will prove the most appalling engineering for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of antisocial nihilistic ethics, individual, social, and political, which the sin-rent world has ever seen. Pro-slavery theologians were also incredibly hostile to the establishment of public education. They were not only didn't think that white families should have to be taxed to, pay for the children of Black families, they were opposed to integration. They were opposed to education for Black people to begin with, because that would sort of, if you keep people uneducated, it's easier to keep them unfree. But they were also very anti-papist and very sort of hostile to many of them, the Catholic faith. And that was sort of a component of their opposition to public education as well. They wanted their religion alone to be taught in public schools, and they wanted their churches to sort of be the basis of education, and they wanted segregation. It really also points to the fact that Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that mandated desegregation, was also like a huge moment for the, I would say, anti-public education movement and for the religious right in this country. Many of the preachers thought that segregation was biblical. They produced sermons along these lines. It's that sort of hostility to the idea that of equality, of pluralism, and of justice that represent the best of the American promise, they're opposed to, full stop. They believe America was founded to be a so-called Christian nation with hierarchies established by God, and any undermining of that is heresy.
Yeah, and a lot of those pastors, especially in the South, still believe and still use their faith to justify a lot of inequitable, if not blatantly racist, types of views and ideology. That's a good segue to, well, not a good segue, but it's a reference back to our previous speaker from last month in our webinar series, Derek Black. He was mentioning a lot of those same types of things and the roots of the attacks on public education coming out of the post-slavery world. So it's interesting that you're making those connections there too. We are a lot of us are obviously in Colorado, and looking through power worshipers, looking through Money, Lies, and God. Colorado comes up often. Why is Colorado significant in all these Christian nationalist efforts?
Colorado is significant because there are large organizations like Truth and Liberty Coalition, which have played an enormous role in trying to shape public education in their districts and in the state. There are a number of allied politicians in Colorado. So it's a very contested state, and there are a lot of contested school boards as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's as I was reading through, as I read through Power Worshippers, as I read through the new one, it's very unnerving to continue to hear your home state being mentioned. As you'd mentioned, David Barton before, one of the primary mythologists of this movement. He sits on the board for the Truth and Liberty Coalition, which is based in Woodland Park, Colorado, about 20 minutes away from me and a lot of us. And we've seen a lot of the influence, specifically within public education. Like, they were one of the primary pushers and motivators for implementing the American birthright standards in the Woodland Park School District, which caused all kinds of issues. Yeah. What are some of the examples about how you've seen Colorado people specifically in these Colorado organizations influencing things both in the state and the national level?
Well, I've seen a lot of sort of Truth and Liberty Coalition. They've sponsored a lot of school board members. They've school board candidates. They've really supported a lot of the Moms for Liberty types in their efforts to, cause a lot of trouble at school board meetings. They've supported a lot of the initiatives that are intended to force religious initiatives into public schools, like sectarian Bible curricula, or some of the other measures that they've been involved with. So
Okay.
you see these organizations sort of getting involved in the fight for education in these various ways.
Okay. We've seen some of this kind of thing happen in Colorado too, where it's either blatant or it appears as if certain school districts or certain policies are being used as test cases for other places around the country. Have you seen other examples where it may seem to be like an isolated case? They're trying something in an isolated way, but that's obviously in an effort to test it, or just to test it so they can apply it someplace else. Is that a common thing?
It's common. I mean, this is an initiative that the religious right rolled out in several years ago, and they called it Project Blitz. The idea was that there are 3 levels. The first level is we're going to insert our version of Christianity into government, and including public schools, government institutions, in ways that seem just merely symbolic, like the 10 Commandments things, or in the "In God We Trust" signs and things like that. The second level is to go a bit deeper and implement, like, a sort of, pro-Christianity week in public schools, or, other sort of sectarian Bible curricula in public schools. And the third level is much more consequential. And they've often, do you know what the American Legislative Exchange Council is? A lot of you listening in probably know. They come up with model legislation, they craft model legislation, and then different politicians who are sort of allied with their agenda will take this model legislation, adapt it for their state, and introduce it through their state legislatures. And we've seen a lot of that happening with these public school initiatives. So from the "In God We Trust" signs to the 10 Commandments laws, to sectarian Bible curricula that's being introduced in states now. I think in Texas, they're actually paying some public school teachers some public schools, if they implement a very sectarian Bible curricula in the public schools, paying teachers extra for this. I mean, it's kind of appalling. So offering financial incentives.
I'm sorry, did you say paying teachers extra?
I think it's the school districts that actually get paid extra. I'm not up on the latest and whether this is being challenged in court, but I know that it's been tried. Chaplains, sectarian religious chaplains, have been introduced in some public school districts in some states. So there are all these different ways in which they're, trying to sort of conflate their version of religion with the authority of the schools. And a lot of these initiatives are coming from, they're the bills that will make this legal are being crafted centrally and then adopted by, they appear to be local. They appear to, they appear to be statewide, but in fact, there's a sort of national coordination.
And they and you talked a lot about this as well, within all of your books, maybe not the Good News Club, but there's a structure and an organization to what it is that they're doing with all of this too.
Yeah. I just want to add something, if you don't mind. David
Sure.
Park played a really key role in Project Blitz. And in fact, some of the audio for their first meetings, they inadvertently put it online, and I was able to access it myself and a few other journalists. And they were talking about how they weren't just trying to, they're not just arguing for a seat at the table in the noisy forum of American democracy. They all often say, oh, it's just free speech. We just want to get our viewpoint across because everybody else is getting their viewpoint across. No, they were really explicit about taking over government, really explicit about what I would say are sort of dominionist goals. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. We were going down the same path there, because anytime someone is starting to bring up these structures and mechanisms, this organization that's involved with this, I automatically start thinking about the Seven Mountains and, and how that's played into all of this, with education being one of those mountains. Could you describe like what the Seven Mountains are and what that goal is?
Thank you so much. Seven Mountains dominionism is the idea that Christians of a certain type should dominate the seven mountains or molders or peaks of culture and society, which include things like government, education, finance, media, et cetera, et cetera. This is a notion that was popularized by this fella named C. Peter Wagner, who is a sort of played a very important role in the rise of independent, charismatic networks, including a sort of affiliated networks called the New Apostolic Reformation. And he came up with this idea of the Seven Mountains Mandate. He said, apostles, they believe that in their hierarchy, they have, apostles have the God-given authority to influence and take charge of a certain segment of society on behalf of the kingdom of God. And he casts this as taking dominion of whatever molder of culture or subdivision God has placed them in, and cast this as taking dominion back from Satan. So any of these molders or mountains or any key feature of government, of society that is not dominated by folks like him or his associates, are actually seen as under the dominion of Satan, not just religiously neutral. I mean, they really don't believe in the concept of neutrality. And that's, a concept that our framers of our Constitution understood very well. This is a concept that our country's founded on, the idea of that there should be church-state separation. Everyone is free to worship any god or sacred idea or none. They're free to worship as they choose, but no one should have to be worshiped. No one should be compelled to worship if they don't want to, and no one should be forced to pay money to support another religion if they don't want to. And the idea that, our laws should be deliberated in public on the basis of rational principles with an eye toward the common good should apply to all of us, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not a government to serve a religious purpose. So the leaders of this movement are very hostile to this principle. This is why I call this movement anti-democratic. They're opposed to democratic institutions and democratic principles. They're opposed to democracy itself. They wrap themselves in the flag and they call themselves patriots, and yet they're hell-bent on undermining every truly sort of patriotic principle that we have.
And that's the thing it's always worried me about all of this, is the anti-democratic aspects to it. I mean, people ask me why I do what I do, why I'm part of Advocates for Public Education, why I try to inform and explain to people. And my simple answer is because I don't want to live in a theocracy, and that's what they're trying to do.
Well, we see examples of theocracies in other places, and
it doesn't work out that well.
What's really interesting is sometimes, people, ask me, are they trying to create a theocracy? But what we see is that in other countries where this kind of thing happens, like if you look at leaders in Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Orban in Hungary, or let's look at Erdogan in Turkey, or many of the other leaders in sort of countries that are established as theocracies, explicit theocracies. These leaders are really, I think that the societies are better described as kleptocratic, nepotistic autocracies with theocratic features. They're not necessarily pure theocracies. What you do is you end up with leaders who are unaccountable to the public for abuses they're perpetrating against their own people. Often they're stealing money from the people, appropriating resources of the public for their own enrichment and for those of their cronies, and controlling the population, with absolute suppression of free speech, absolute suppression of political opposition, but exploiting religion in order to sort of consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power. And, back to the Seven Mountains Mandate, we see a lot of folks who are like, David Barton, who is, I would say, a key myth maker of the Christian nationalist movement, explicitly allied with organizations that advocate for Seven Mountains dominionism. But what we've also seen is that the language and style of sort of the Seven Mountains mandate has spilled over into other areas of the movement that are not themselves remotely, I would say, charismatic, as C. Peter Wagner was played a role in planting these sort of charismatic church networks. And so, you have people like Roger Stone, who is a longtime advisor of Donald Trump, talking about how there was a demonic portal opening above the Biden White House. And you have people like Paula White, who has been a longtime advisor to Trump, now has a role in his White House, of course, as a sort of director of faith outreach or something like that. She was, she is actually coming out of that charismatic tradition, but using a lot of that language. But you have, people like, I don't know, a lot of other Trump allies who are, again, either Catholic, identify as Catholic, or identify people like Mike Johnson, who is no proof that he's charismatic at all. He appears to be affiliated with more like, kind of Southern Baptist Convention type evangelicalism. But he too has used the language and style of Seven Mountains Dominionism. At times, he's actually appeared on explicitly Seven Mountains Dominionist podcasts and things like that. So you have this idea of a sort of metaphor of total societal control spilling into areas of the movement that are themselves not coming out of those charismatic networks.
Which is also disturbing too, whenever you start to see very, very mainstream. There was a documentary on Netflix about the dancers, the 7M films that were making videos on Instagram and TikTok go viral. That was controlled directly by Seven Mountains Dominionists. That the kind of thing like always worries me too. So just as a reminder to everyone too, that if you do have some questions for Katherine, then you can use the Q&A function that's within Zoom, and we'll be answering some of those here shortly. But as we're getting closer and closer to that Q&A part, I wanted to shift a little bit because from following you as long as I have, and then reading through your books, you don't just report on what you're finding in documents. You're going into these places and hearing directly from them. Through all of that, your experience doing that, you've probably and have interacted with a lot of communities too. What have you seen that's been really effective to fight this within local communities?
I think that those of us who believe in the principles of democracy and its institutions, the principles of equality and pluralism and justice, represent a majority of the population, not a minority. We are the majority, and we just need to act like it. The movement is really effective at mobilizing its people in disproportionate numbers. It's been organizing at the local community level, local level, national, like state level, national level for a long time. And I think for quite a long time, others, those of us who support these sort of principles were, we were like, thought everything was fine. And, oh, it's so boring to get involved in this local governance. Let somebody else do it. If you stand back and you think someone else is going to do it, who shows up is the Moms for Liberty, with their crazy allegations that, marching into public school libraries and saying, where's the pornography section? It's like there's no pornography section. So, it's really important to get involved in local governance. Local action really matters. There are also a lot of pro-democracy organizations out there. They need and deserve our support. It's really important to accept one another, meet people where they are. We're not going to agree on everything. We're a big, noisy democracy. I think we need a big tent. And we would do well to heed the words of a former president. The person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. So I think we would do well to sort of reflect on that and make common cause with those who agree with us on certain basic principles, who agree with us on the importance of strong public education and strong democratic institutions, fair votes, the principles of equality, and things like that. And when we have disagreements at the margins, we need to give one another a bit of grace and find a way to work together. These are just a few recommendations. There are so many others. At the end of my book, Money Lies in God, I have a whole section on what is to be done. And look, I'm not an activist or strategist. I'm an investigative reporter, but I have been reporting on this movement for a long time to show how they did it. And I think I have sort of observed their movement long enough to make some basic recommendations. The first step, of course, is to get out of bed and take that first step, and don't ever, ever underestimate the power of what one determined person can do.
I think that's great advice. And I think that's the hardest part of this entire thing, is just taking that first step. But once you take that first step, then it's also very difficult to stop.
Yeah.
Once you've gotten that momentum.
And it's joyful. When you get involved in the fight for democracy, there is no more meaningful fight out there. And you're also going to meet the best people,
Oh, yeah. But that have on one of the positive notes, all of my friends, my current friends now that I do consider to be my true friends, are people that I've met along this journey, because whenever you find someone else who has the same passion for just simply defending democracy, that's the basis of really good friendships too. Is there anything else before we go on to some of the questions, which are some good ones that are coming up in Q&A already? Is there anything else that I have not asked that you think is important that you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I think that we've covered a lot, but I could just keep talking about this stuff because I can't stop writing about it. I think when people talk about Christian nationalism, it's very hard for a lot of people to do that because it has to do with religion, and we want to respect one another's faith and backgrounds, and we want to be tolerant. But I think that people underestimate the degree of hostility that movement leaders show toward their fellow Christians who are not on board with this message and with this agenda. So as you said, it's true, I go into right-wing spaces and gatherings and meetings and the like, because, I'm an on-the-ground investigative reporter in addition to, the other research that I do. And so I went to America Fest. It was put on by Turning Point USA. There were 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters in Phoenix, Arizona, the convention center. And I was really surprised because this is, do you know what Charlie Kirk is? He's a very important young leader of the movement. He gets a lot of young people involved. He recruits them and finds talent, and played an important role in turning out the vote in 2024 for Trump. And he's got a director of faith outreach, a guy named Lucas Miles, who wrote a book titled Woke Jesus. And I can't remember the subtitle. It's something like The Heresy Destroying the Christian Church. And he's basically calling fellow Christians, woke and saying that they're destroying, heretical. And I think, okay, so what counts as woke? He specifically named the social gospel. He specifically named, the historical Jesus movement is what he calls it, liberation theology, and what he said, Black liberation theology, because they have to get a little racism in there somewhere, right? It's sort of all over, the sort of, I would say, both acknowledged and also a lot of unacknowledged racism as well. But it's the contempt with which movement leaders think about and talk about their fellow Christians who are not on board with their agenda is tremendous. I do a lot of public speaking, and I would say maybe 30 to 40% of my talks are at churches. There are a lot of pastors, a lot of congregations who are really upset about the exploitation of their faith and to destroy the democracy that they hold dear. So I think it's really important, sort of going back to your first question, how is this different from Christianity? Religion in its expressions is incredibly diverse, but it's really important to note that that this, that I think the sort of woke Christians, as what they movement leaders would call the folks that I often talk to, are, they reserve some of the most poisonous words for them.
I've often tried to warn them that they're coming for you too. It's not just the marginalized. It's not just the non-Christians. They're coming for the people who aren't the right kinds of Christians too.
Yeah, at that event, the faith outreach director, Lucas Miles, said, "We're forming a new Nicene Creed and Council," referring to the 4th century synod that established the key doctrines of Christianity. And he said, "We're doing that. I'm working with 3,500 pastors." So they basically, I think in his mind, they're like, we want to be able to say that these churches are Christian and those other, woke churches are not Christian at all, which is really kind of disgraceful and shocking.
That's pretty bold.
Yeah.
It's okay. We're going to switch over to taking some of the questions out of Q&A. In the first, and Mike, I'll go ahead and take this as I'm looking at them too, if that works. The first one that's up here is a good one. I'll just read it to you. Our senior senator, now a candidate for governor, is an unapologetic supporter of charter schools. How do we effectively educate voters that Colorado charter schools increasingly are schools started and supported by Christian nationalists? And this person's referring to Michael Bennett.
Yeah, it's really a challenge. There are some good charter schools out there, but there's so much such a lack of regulation in the charter sector. And people with Betsy DeVos, who is an early promoter of what they call school choice, they really started with vouchers. They kept promoting vouchers, and they kept putting forth voucher initiatives in the states. They kept getting voted down over and over and over again because voters do not want to defund their public schools. And they also understand implicitly that direct funding of religious schools is simply unconstitutional. It's something that has been established through a number of different court cases over time. And it's against, the spirit of the Constitution. So what the movement leaders decided to do is sort of flip to this idea of school choice. And there was sort of nascent charter movement that was initially, in its early days, started not to have these big charter networks, but more to sort of workshop new ideas and perhaps introduce them later into public schools if they seem to do well. But the sort of Christian nationalists, I would say the Christian right leaders who wanted to defund public schools and saw them as sort of, they were very hostile to them. understood that if they made common cause with the pro-charter forces, they could achieve their aims, but be able to market this in a better way under the idea of school choice. We had people like, Milton Friedman, of course, and his successors in the libertarian tradition, also supporting the idea of school choice. The idea, of course, is that they wanted any kind of private funding. I'm sorry, they didn't want public funded schools in the way that they were being carried out. They sort of endorsed this idea that parents should get to choose. The money should follow the child, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't really believe in this idea of state-supported education as a sort of institution. They wanted it sort of, in the sort of far-right libertarian ethos of parents get to control where the money goes exactly, and who cares about, poor kids who don't get educated at all, So that sort of alliance between, I call them the proselytizers and the privatizers, has been one of the ways in which movement leaders have tried to destroy public education. Now, the privatizers, the pro-charter folks, often the rhetoric sounds good. We just want choice, but what the net effect is not just to defund public schools and to reduce public schools as a viable option that's workable for kids, but also to create these networks and put money in the pockets of they call them education entrepreneurs. They're just simply entrepreneurs who see in charter schools an opportunity for making huge amounts of money. So in states with unregulated charters like Arizona, you have people who have, like this one fellow, I have two examples in my book, The Power Worshippers. One guy formed a network of 4 charter schools, sold it to a bunch of his buddies. All of this is taxpayer funded, and then pocketed $8 million of taxpayer money in a few short years. It's basically a huge transfer of taxpayer money into his own pockets because he's formed a bunch of charter schools. And by the way, a lot of the charter schools, when they close, because for lack of students or because of mismanagement, or maybe they've just taken too much money out of the charters, because the push, of course, in the charter network is to have them be unaccountable, no financial transparency. What do those kids do? All of a sudden, from one day to the next, the school closes. A lot of the charter schools have also been shown to be run by people with far-right ideological economic agendas or far-right religious agendas. And in some of the schools, like where there are some of the states where these charter schools, as some reporters have said, it's really hard to see where the church ends and where the school begins, because the school is filled with so much religious or quasi-religious messaging and imagery. So the charter world is a kind of Wild West. But what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of graft. And there are newspapers like, I believe it's the Orlando Sentinel. It's like in Florida, they have done extraordinary reporting. And I think there's a school, also a newspaper in Michigan. They've done extraordinary reporting on one charter scandal after another, where you have these corrupt folks enriching themselves at the public expense and at the expense of children, at the expense of their education, operating in these nepotistic ways, teaching, frankly, garbage in their schools, in many instances, lack of accountability. That's not to say there aren't some good charters, because there are some good charters out there, but regulation is really critical, and it's also really critical to make sure that it doesn't interrupt the funding for public education in ways that is going to harm those public schools and the really important services that they offer to all children and their families.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll just try and summarize a few questions, put them into one. One of the attendees, Catherine, is asking about who's involved in the movement. I'll ask both questions here. For instance, how deep are the Catholic bishops and cardinals into this movement? That was one question. And then secondly, this person is asking, why are so many Democrats and wealthy Democratic supporters putting their money into the charters and support for vouchers that could bring theocracy into our schools? So I know that's a two-part question, but let's see if you can kind of elaborate on that.
They're both great questions. The first is that the movement, people often look at this movement as being synonymous with white evangelicalism. And it's true that like large numbers of white evangelicals support this movement, but some white evangelicals do not support this movement. And the movement derives support from others who are, I would say, some, like, look at the funders. Religiously, they're all over the place. Some of them are evangelical, some are ultra-conservative Catholics, some are Jewish, some are atheistic, but they're pouring their money into the infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement. Some of them for religious and cultural reasons, but others, I think that the thing that really unites them is that they support libertarian, far-right sort of economic ideology that is going to help them grow their fortunes, which are already massive, deregulatory environments, so that they can expand their businesses in the way that they want. Some of them are in polluting businesses. I think about the Wilkes brothers, who are big funders of the movement. They're involved in fracking, so they don't want any environmental policies that are going to interfere with that. Same time, they say they just want the markets and let the markets do their things, but they also want to pursue privileged contracts for their monopolistic businesses, and in many instances, they want public funding for their initiatives. And the leadership of the movement, not just the funding, but the leadership of the movement is also diverse, and the rank and file is diverse. The movement includes a cohort, I would say, in the leadership cadre of ultra-conservative Catholics. And also, I would say the movement is getting new energy from independent charismatic movements and sort of right-wing Pentecostals. So it's very diverse now, and it's in all levels of the the leadership, and also diverse amongst the rank and file.
Thank you.
And then the second question is, just look at the Supreme Court. There's been a lot of money put into shaping the court in the way that it has. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with a fellow named Leonard Leo. He's played an outsized role, not just in raising and spending money for the movement overall, but in shaping the courts and grooming talent, sort of. And we have a sort of very strong sort of Leo himself is an ultra-conservative Catholic, and he has played a role in sort of bringing many of these sort of Catholic justices onto the courts as well. Although, again, Catholicism is incredibly diverse, just as evangelicalism is. Catholics in particular are kind of the jump ball of American politics. So I'm not suggesting, again, that all Catholics are on board with this movement, hardly. But it's diverse. And the second question had to do, would you mind repeating the second question, Mike? I'm sorry.
Sure. Why do so many Democrats and wealthy Democratic supporters put their money into charters and support vouchers that could or would bring theocracy into the schools?
Yeah, I really think that among a cadre of ultra wealthy people, even those who support democracy and its institutions, or vote for Democratic candidates, there's this reluctance to deal with some of the systematic problems, sort of systematic wealth inequality problems, to put it in a very succinct way, that are leading to societal dysfunction. Over the past decades, we've had this massive concentration of wealth at the tippy top of the economic ladder. And it's easier in a way to say, oh, if we just fix education, then we don't have to worry about anything else. And I think some folks are sometimes fall prey to that idea. Now, of course, we need better public schools. Schools can always be improved. But if you look at the amounts of money that have flown into the charter sector, it's really a tragedy, because if some of that money had been put into improving public education, offering wraparound services to families that need them through the public schools. And this is a great thing about having community schools, is it's much easier to offer wraparound services and after-school programming and things like that. We really might be in a better place overall with our sort of education ecosystem.
Right.
So I think that that's part of the problem, a kind of faith in a way in this sort of, libertarian ideology that says, oh, if we let the markets do their system, they'll solve everything. And that just hasn't proven to be the case in the charter sector. In fact, I think if you look at the states where you have unregulated charters, you've just seen a tremendous amount of corruption.
Yeah.
And adverse outcomes for a lot of kids, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it creates a lot of disruption across the system and within communities, which you pointed out very well. Thank you for that. Rob, you want to take the next one?
I think we're like right at time.
Okay.
Catherine, can we ask one more question and then we'll conclude?
Sure.
This is this one, it could be interesting, and maybe you've come across this, during a lot of your investigations, reporting your relationships with people in communities. The question is, how can school board members in small rural communities compete with these religious candidates that get huge funding from out-of-state donors and have "quote unquote" God on their side? What have you come up? Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great question. One thing to point out is that those folks want to siphon money away from public schools, and the rural schools are going to close. They're really important. There's not options in that area. You close the public school, and that's really going to be a horrible thing for that community. So I think to show that their overall agenda is not going to help their local public schools. Look, I think some 85% or more of Americans still send their children to public schools. They support their public schools. They want them to be improved, and they really want to do well by them. So to show the anti-public education agenda that these folks have signed on to, and also some of the rhetoric behind the people that are funding them, the sort of hateful rhetoric about public education, or hateful rhetoric amongst their allies in the religious right, might actually help open some eyes. And it's also it would be also helpful to connect with faith-based organizations that support public education, and there are many of them out there.
Excellent point. There's
a great point.
In Texas, Pastors for Children, that's worked very hard, very good group that is very supportive of public education. I just want to mention a couple of other things. You've really hit the nail on the head, Catherine, in terms of what's happening right now in Colorado. We had a state-appointed organization called the Charter School Institute that just approved one of these schools that you just described so well. It's called the John Adams Academy, which is run by a man who is a devout Christian, who believes that debauchery is happening in all the public schools, and who is promoting his own messaging. And yet this school was not supported by the community in any way, but this institute that is appointed by the governor approved it last week. And we really need to be aware of this in our state and do what we can. And I can't thank you enough for your messaging today. We are going to have this video on our website in a few days. I urge you all to buy the book. It's fantastic. The last chapter is amazing in terms of how it shows how we can push back against this movement that is insidious and is throughout the Trump administration now, folks, and it's throughout many states across our country. Rob, if you have any last words, I do also want to encourage attendees to consider donating to A4PEP. We work very hard to inform our legislators about what's happening, and we're on the ground trying to build coalitions against this movement and try to support our public schools and to build ways that we can continue our public education system. We can't thank you enough, Katherine. And Rob, if you have any last words, this was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And Katherine, once again, I can't thank you enough for doing this. I was everything that I hoped that it would be in your voice, your words, your research, your work. I mean, I hope you know that it's incredibly appreciated and it's very, very important.
Well, I can't thank you guys enough. Really, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do. It's really vital at this time, and I'm just grateful to all of you who tuned in today to participate, and encourage you to get involved locally and nationally in any way that you can.
And
I want to thank you too, Katherine. This is Judy speaking. We really, really appreciate you taking your time, and so appreciate your books. We encourage everybody to go out and buy a book and read it. And we again, thank you so much.
Links to all of Katherine's book, they are in the chat. I've been spreading them out, as we've been having the discussion. Her Substack is also, the link to it is also there, and also her Blue Sky profile, and lots of different ways that you can interact and learn from her throughout it. But so, Katherine, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have one more.
Rob,
go ahead.
Rob, would you just tell people what our next webinar is going to be about?
That's what I'm about to do, like right now, which should be on the screen now. So on August 20th, we talked about Logan Davis just earlier within the discussion with Katherine. Logan Davis confirmed with him this morning that he's going to come and talk with us on August 20th at 6:30. We'll be going back to our normal time. And Logan has been working on, rather than collecting research to present in an article maybe towards the end of the school board election cycle, he's been doing this on a more ongoing basis so it can be used as more of an information and warning. And so we don't have to react, or we don't have to be told about things that happen after the fact. We can see them as they're happening. So he and I are going to be having a conversation about what he's been gathering about school board elections in Colorado on August 20th. So we'll be sending out announcements, registration links for that soon. But go ahead and pencil that in your calendar. August 20th at 6:30 p.m. It's a Wednesday. And I believe that is all. Thank you again, Katherine, for that. Thanks, as always, Mike and Judy, for what you do. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. And we will talk to you all again in August.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.